Hello, readers. Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Grammar, and today we will read and analyze excerpts from the Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. Montresor, the narrator, seeks revenge against Fortunato for an unspecified insult. During a carnival, Montresor lures Fortunato into his family catacombs with the promise of tasting a rare wine called Amontillado. Deep underground, Montresor chains Fortunato to a wall and seals him in with bricks, leaving him to die. The story ends with Montresor revealing that no one has disturbed Fortunato's resting place for 50 years. The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. It was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length, I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. The setting takes place at dusk in a carnival-like atmosphere. Montresor, the protagonist or anti-hero, claims that Fortunato has offended him numerous times. Montresor is hungry for revenge and willing to make it a reality. He had a weak point, this Fortunato. Although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Fortunato is a wine connoisseur, or perhaps an alcoholic, so Montresor plans to expose Fortunato's weak point to Montresor's advantage. Amontillado! A pipe? Impossible. And in the middle of the carnival? I have my doubts, I replied, and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain. Montresor acts gullible and unknowledgeable about the Amontillado that is being sold to him, or was sold to him. He consults with Fortunato for his wine expertise. Fortunato becomes overly excited and determined to put his expertise to use to investigate whether the Amontillado is authentic. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descended again, arrived at a deep crypt in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeau rather to glow than flame. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damps. Here, I knocked off the neck of a bottle, which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mold. Drink, I said, presenting him with the wine. The wine sparkled in his eyes, and the bells jingled. Both characters walked through the catacombs, underground, chambers or tunnels primarily used for burial and religious rituals. Naively, Fortunato follows along, blinded by his obsession with wine. Montresor offers Fortunato another wine as they walk through the catacombs. Fortunato, with great thirst, accepts the drink. The Amontillado! Yelled my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. True, I replied, the Amontillado. As I said these words, I busied myself among the piles of bones, of which I have before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. At this point, Fortunato is too desperate and intoxicated to realize that there are human bones in front of him. Montresor is preparing to build a wall and trap an intoxicated Fortunato inside. In other words, Montresor is going to kill Fortunato. I had scarcely laid the first tier of my masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in a great measure worn off. I laid the second tier, and the third, and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. Montresor begins to build a wall that traps an intoxicated Fortunato inside. However, as Montresor reaches higher tiers of the wall, Fortunato seems to come to his senses and panic erupts. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For the love of God, Montresor. Yes, I said, for the love of God. But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, Fortunato! No answer. I called again, Fortunato! No answer still. At this point, Fortunato's excitement for the Amontillado is gone. Now, Fortunato is plagued with fear and desperation. He begs Montresor to let him go. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position and plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For half a century, no mortal has disturbed them. Montresor is more concerned about the dampness of the catacombs than the cold, calculated murder that he commits. This is a sign of a psychopath. Montresor organizes the surrounding bones when he finishes the wall. For half a century, no one has discovered Montresor's murderous acts. Fortunato is left to age like a cask or a bottle of Amontillado for half a century.